Uncle Ron stuff. Today is the 27th of May, 2024. And I got an email from my oldest grandchild, Olivia, granddaughter. And she's doing some sort of history project and was interested. I guess she was given the option of time periods, and she was interested in the 1950s in the 1960s in America, and I think she was allowed to pick a famous person and write a fictional daily journal for such a person. And instead of picking a fictional character or a real character, she chose me. So it got me thinking about what could I possibly tell her about 1950s. And I thought I would do a video about it, and maybe she could look at it first, and it might provide some background that she could incorporate in her fictionalized journal. Anyway, so this is going to be about 1950 to start with. And I was born in 1946. The war, and that's the major point I want to make about 1950s, the war, World War II, still was having a significant impact on everybody who lived in America. And it really didn't matter much where you lived, in a city or on a farm or wherever you were. The war impact and the impacts it had on America was still rippling through every dimension of the culture, society, the economics, everything. Um, I was born in 1946, so I'm one of the early baby boomers. After the war and return of the servicemen to the United States, there were a lot of marriages, and within a year or two began a lot of births, and it resulted in a huge number of babies, population growth. That was one of the things that occurred in the late 1940s and stretched into the 1950s. I don't know what's considered the baby boom era, but it probably lasted for 10, 12 years, and I'm one of the earlier ones. The war had ended in 1944 in Germany and ended in 1945 in Japan, but it still had significant ramifications. Yes, the war wound down. We had, I don't know how many million servicemen, but there was a big reduction in the number of military people in uniform, and they returned home looking for work, going back to their parents or families or whatever it was. And to some extent, it mattered how old you were when you came out of the military and where you had lived prior to that. One of the things that occurred because of World War II was servicemen were called, men were called and drafted all over the United States and then sent to some other part of the United States for training. They may have been from Louisiana, and they might have been sent to Florida or California or on the East Coast, West Coast, and the middle of Texas. They could have been sent anywhere, and that was probably the first time they'd ever traveled outside of their locality. They might have grown up with their parents and their family members in a small city or town, or maybe in a large city, but this was the first introduction to other people who had other cultures, other lifestyles, had lived in other parts of the countries and had different ways about them. And they adopted some of those, at least they became aware of it when they were in military service by moving around. Many were sent overseas. They saw how other people lived there. The war could be very horrible. Many were killed. Americans and as well as Europeans, Japanese, Filipinos, Australians. It was a big giant mass death event, and it left its scars. Anyway, after the war was over, men came back who had dropped everything and could have been gone for 2, 3, 4, even 5 years away from their family, their homes. Some returned to their home place, some did not. They had been trained in Texas, they like Texas. They may have met a girl there. They may have developed friends, or they might have seen an opportunity where they could take what little money they had and buy a farm or do something else. There was a giant migration after World War II. Not everybody returned home, and so there were a lot of cultural and other changes after the war. The war impacted everybody and everything. The United States geared up and was economically war in the 1940s and afterwards. Now, after the release of all these servicemen, the Army, Air Force, Navy were still building torpedoes and ships. They didn't drop all that stuff. And aircraft, yes, the rate of production of B-29s and all that stuff dropped down, of course, but they were still needed because the Russians now had become a threat in Europe. The war had ended, but the Russians, a major player in World War II, because they were part of Europe, they had provided a massive land army that pushed the Germans out of Russia and moved into territories that had been occupied by the Germans and took them over, and basically was really visible for everybody to see. Their intent was they weren't, when they captured a particular area or freed it from Germans, they didn't leave. They were planned on it being part of their new territory. And thus, it was that's what happened in the 50s, was the creation of the Soviet Union, where they had Ukraine and Lithuania and Poland and Czechoslovakia, and all these countries had been occupied by Germany, came under the influence of the Russians, and our government had already deemed that they were going to be a big power in Europe and potential threat to Europeans and world peace and stability. So our war effort really didn't end there. And when I talk about the war continuing, for example, I was born in 46. I was 4 years old in 1950. Now, both sides of my parents, there were large families, not uncommon at the time. My mother was one of 5. My father was one of 4. In the case of my father, he had all brothers. His oldest brother had been of age, and he did go into the military during the war, got trained as some kind of electrical and testing equipment. I'm not sure he ever saw overseas. I don't know that, but I know that after the war, he came back and went to work at a factory that built equipment that he had been using during the war. And it was in Baltimore. It was not in a home town at all. And he started a family there, and thus the migration I'm talking about. My father had been, I guess, drafted at some time, but released because he had had polio early in his life, and he was classified 4F or whatever, and let go from the military. His younger brother, my Uncle Olin, was in the military, drafted or whatever, sometime in the early 50s, and sent to Germany as part of the occupation forces. Again, World War II still had a significant influence. My Uncle Glenn, the youngest of my father's brothers, he also, at early age, 16, 17, 18, was sent to occupying forces in Germany. We had a large presence in Europe as an occupying army for Germany. Okay, we had the same sort of thing in Japan. Many men may have come back from the military, but were called up again and sent to Japan as an occupying force. They were there to establish a democracy under sort of the guidelines of what America was like, and also to keep the peace and make sure that Japanese didn't decide to try to do the whole thing over again. So in the case of my mother's family, one of my uncles in early 1950 was either drafted or enlisted, I'm not sure which, into the Marines. He disappeared for like 6, 7 years. He was in the Marines that period of time. I don't think he ever spent any time overseas, but I'm not 100% sure of that. The other uncles in my mother's family, my mother's oldest brother, I don't know. He was of age. I don't know if he served in the military or not. He probably did, but I'm not aware of it. He came back and did not return to the home place. He got a job as a government food inspector in New Jersey and started a family there. He did not return to his home place, so there was a lot of migration going on. Okay, so I was born in 46. I'm 4 years old in 1950. At that time, my parents, I was the only child, firstborn. So we lived in a rental property, and my grandparents had lived in the Shenandoah Valley, and so on both sides, my mother and father's parents, my grandparents had lived in the Shenandoah Valley, the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley. The valley is defined by the Appalachian Mountains on the west, and then it flattens out, and it's sort of a very broad valley that's great for agriculture, and had been so for years, and originally settled by Irish Germans. Irish and the Germans were in there. Where my grandparents lived up in the mountains on a big farm, there were German-speaking people in the area, and they would often come by and speak German. So not only was the immigration going on in America of American peoples themselves, you also had immigration coming from Europe. People had dumped out of Europe and had come to the United States at that time to get away from what was going on in Europe. So you had this influx of immigrants as well coming in speaking different languages. So in 1950 or so, I was 4 years old, and we lived in a rental house in a small town called Winchester, Virginia, which had been around for a long, long time. It's the north end of the Shenandoah Valley. Was a good-sized town, and because it had a railroad head there was a railroad came through, and I'm not sure where it all went, but it probably went to Washington, D.C., to the closest local cities. And during the Civil War, Winchester had been a significant railhead. The Shenandoah Valley was known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. The farming was good there. The land was rich, so corn, wheat, all sorts of crops were raised there, taken by probably wagon into Winchester, where it was loaded on the railroad and moved around the Confederacy. So there was a lot of Civil War had been fought in and around that particular area. We lived just outside of the city limits of Winchester at the time in a small rental house with a dirt road out front. There were houses on either side. It was a street, but unpaved. And at the age of maybe 5 or 6, we moved to a larger rental house on the city street in Winchester. Now, I'm sure all this depends where you were born and where your parents had migrated to or not. I was in a small town, but I was on a city street at the age of 5 or 6, and my parents were both working at the time. My father had not graduated from high school, did not have a skill set. He worked for a while, and so did my mother, and woolen mill. And there were 2 large woolen mills in the Winchester area at that time, both producing products for the Army. Woolen blankets, perhaps woolen uniforms, I don't remember exactly. But the war effort had stretched into every possible location. Now, where the wool came from that went to those factories, I'm not sure, because I never saw a lot of sheep in the area, but it could have been in the Shenandoah Valley. The wool might have been locally grown, but there were wool factories there that were dedicated to producing products for the military. My mother and father worked in those woolen mills. So did my mother's father and her aunt and uncle for a long time, because it was local and it was a steady job, paid. And they both worked at the wall mill, and from an early time, I was a latch kid. While my both parents worked, which was required since they didn't have a strong skill set, they made probably very little money, enough to rent a home and pay utilities and so on, but that was about the limit. In fact, in my particular case, I grew up in a hunting fishing family. My grandfather and all my uncles on both sides, and my grandmother and grandparents' van living on a farm, they grew what they needed. They logged, they timbered, they lived off the land. They were literally off the grid for a long time. They had electricity early on, but not indoor plumbing. This was back out in the country. Electricity didn't, it was coming, and it had been coming for years, but it took a long time for electricity to make its way all across every little corner of the United States. And that was still going on in the 1950s. Rural electrification. As well as most people didn't have city water or sewer. They had to dig wells. You had to rely on a septic system if you had, or in my grandparents' case early on, they lived on a farm. We had an outhouse. Yes, an actual go outside to a wooden thing that had two holes in it. That was life at the time. And we visited my grandparents pretty frequently. They were a source of food. They raised pigs, chickens, cows, and they did the slaughtering of those animals. And I remember probably I was about 6 or 7 attending where they had butchering day. And it was common for neighbors to get together and help. And they would slaughter 6 or 7 big-sized pigs and completely process that pig, making everything you think of from it, from soap to sausage to bacon, everything. And that was a communal effort. People I never knew came in to help do that. Same way at the time, communities helped each other build barns, help with the haying or taking in the crops, because usually there was a short period of time for that. So 6 and 7, I have memories of those sorts of things. At age 6, my younger brother was born. He was 4 years younger than I was, and I have a clear memory of him coming home from the hospital. He was not born at home. I was also born in a hospital in Winchester. Prior to that, many babies were born at home. That was not uncommon, and depending on where you lived, we lived with a place where there was a hospital. If you went down the Shenandoah Valley, if you went south down the Shenandoah Valley, there was one major road. It had been a road forever and ever. The Confederate Army had used it for movement up and down. And along that road, there now and then, every 10, 20 miles, there'd be a small gathering of houses and someone who sold dry goods, a little market. And those dotted the road south from Winchester all the way to the end of Virginia, around Route 11, the central road going through Virginia at the time, one main road. Now, during the 1950s, and one of the things after the war, as you know, is General Eisenhower, who had been chief commander of all the U.S. forces, I think primarily in Europe, but nonetheless, he was elected president as a Republican after probably 1952. That's probably when it was. And he set about looking forward to what we needed in the United States for the next 20, 30 years. At that particular time, the government, after the war, began to look at, okay, what do we need to be doing here? And one thing he did was establish the interstate highway system and started funding it, and that's why we have an interstate system today. Major roads between major cities in the United States. And I guess they still build them as cities get larger and larger, and you need connections directly between two major cities. But at that time, there were no such interstates. It was dirt roads and lots of places. And there would be 2-lane roads, not 4-lane roads. 2-lane roads were the major highways for movement of cars between places. And yes, cars became more popular. There had been limited car production during the war, and after the war, car auto production ramped up again. People went to work in the factories to make the cars, and in my case, yeah, I think my father in 1952 or thereabouts bought a brand new Ford. He'd been driving, and I don't remember before that, but some old car. And so we got a brand new car. I have no idea how he paid for it. It might have been $1,000 at the time. I don't remember, but I remember the new car. And we still lived in this rental home on City Street. The other thing of note at the time was, as I told you, the baby boom generation started. So in the neighborhood I lived in, there were lots and lots of kids. Now I was the oldest, but there were, I can easily count 9 kids within walking distance or a short bicycle ride of where I've lived. So I was always with a gang of kids when we met and played with each other all the time. Some kids were younger and some were only children, and they had lots of toys, and I would go visit their places and play with their toys. We were never poor in that sense. We had food to eat, we had shelter. I was never cold in the winter. On the other hand, we didn't have a lot of money for toys or other things. And if we took a vacation, it was a camping trip. We went someplace, camped along a river, we caught fish, we ate the fish. Again, a hunting background. My father was always hunting. I grew up on venison, rabbit, squirrels, turkey, all wild, all hunted. I don't remember hardly ever going to a grocery store. I know that's hard to believe, but I don't. Now, my grandparents lived up on a farm. They lived a good 10 miles from the nearest small town where they did have, and nothing was, no chain stores at the time. There was no supermarkets, no Walmarts, no Kmarts, Home Depots, anything like that. It was all mom and pop. There was a large hardware store in Winchester that had been there for probably during the war called Miller's Hardware, and they stocked everything. And people came from up and down the Shenandoah Valley to go to that one store because they had it. That was the kind of economics that was in place at the time. There were no fast food restaurants. It was all mom and pop restaurants, and they came and went all the time. There was no Chinese food in the city of Winchester. There was no ethnic food of any kind in the city of Winchester for me growing up. That came in later, but at the time, it was meat and potatoes. That's what everybody ate. That's what you did. The meat, my parents, my dad, we killed it and skunned it and ate it ourselves. Everybody had gardens. We had a garden in the backyard. We grew corn and watermelons and tomatoes. Everybody did that. Next door neighbor had cherry trees. He grew cherry trees. One of my friends down the street, his grandfather had an egg farm. This is in the city. Had an egg farm. He also had beehives for honey. And he sold eggs and honey honey door to door. And door to door was common at the time. People would come by selling encyclopedias. People would come by selling vacuum cleaners. Anything and everything. There would be a door to door salesman. And that's one of the jobs people had at the time. Again, my parents worked at the woolen mill. My mother graduated from high school. She became an accountant. In the Winchester area, there had been a lot of fruit trees. I got told stories about Johnny Appleseed, who came through the area and just sprinkled apple seeds everywhere, and so the place was thick with apple trees, and Winchester was known as the apple capital of the world. There were more apples there, so there were plants in Winchester and cold storages from probably during the war, started then at that time, and apples were taken in and they were processed and canned and also stored in these large, giant freezing buildings that were located in the city of Winchester. Massive, huge storage facilities that kept food cold. Again, there was a railroad coming through there, so stuff moved in and out. My mother went to work for one of the Apple companies. I think it was called White House at the time, and I think it was still around. There was also a larger Apple processing plant just over the state line in West Virginia. And again, I was at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley. And from Winchester to West Virginia was like 20 miles or so, or something like that. I was almost out the state. And so in some sense, Virginia and West Virginia bled together, and they were in fact different too. They had different dynamics of economics and culturally and every other aspect, but they bled together. Okay, at age 6 or 7, school. Okay, and I don't remember any sort of testing. I don't remember knowing how to read at that age. Again, I don't remember a lot of books. My parents always bought, my father used to buy hunting magazines. And I think Reader's Digest was a common book that most people had at the time. I put it in passing. We also attended church. My grandmother Stultz, that's my father's mother, was matriarch of that family. She was the queen. Whatever she said, my grandfather and all of his sons, they paid attention to. Serious. She was the matriarch of the family, and she went to church. And so my grandfather went to church, and all of his sons went to church. And when we were old enough, I went to church. I was baptized in the Presbyterian church at the time. We had other denominations in the area. There was only one Catholic church at the time, and at that particular time, Catholics were still looked upon as. There was some carryover from Europe. If you remember, migration came from Europe to the United States, and my roots are German and Irish back in the old country. And so religion came as well with you. And so there were various religious denominations, and yes, churches. And the banks and the churches were the strongest, biggest buildings in any city up and down the Shenandoah Valley. Banks were always on corners and massive, built out of stone. Those were solid. The idea that the bank was solid. Remember, there had been a depression in the 1930s, and the banks had failed, and so to reestablish the very concept that you could put your money in the bank and get it back later was big stone buildings. They had those, and the churches were also stone. There were smaller wooden churches out in the county, the outlands, but churches were everywhere. That was a common thing, and many people did go to church. Again, there was one Catholic church in Winchester for the whole, I don't even know where the next one was, probably 50, 100 miles away. But there was a Catholic church there. And I won't go any farther on that one, but there were also blacks in Winchester at the time. It was segregated. Yes, Winchester was a southern town, and segregation was ripe and alive there. Now, I never saw any racism per se, blatant, violent racism at the age of 6, 7, 8. Not me. I did not see it. I also lived on a street where everybody was white. There were no blacks in the neighborhood. When I went to elementary school to age 6 or 7, there were no black kids in that school. All white. School. I don't remember any tests. I don't remember knowing how to read, but somehow or another I was placed in the 2nd grade to start with. I don't know what the deal was on that. Maybe there were too many of us, and they said, well, we only got one teacher for the 1st grade, and there was 30 kids. You got to go to the 2nd grade. I'm not sure that's not what happened. But anyway, it was obvious from the start that was not 2nd grade material. So I went into the 1st grade, and that's when I discovered part of what they were doing at the time was establishing some sort of health regimen. During World War II, what had been the introduction of toothbrushes. Before that, brushing your teeth was not common in the United States. The military started that when they started giving out food rations and those sorts of things. They also provided toothbrush and toothpaste. There was a campaign for people to learn how to brush their teeth. Before that, no, it hadn't been done, which resulted in, like, my grandparents and my parents all having false teeth by the time they were age 50 or so. Okay? Sad note. But in the schools, they had started looking at the health of the students. So I was tested for hearing, tested for sight. I'm not sure about vaccinations at the time. Polio, the whole vaccine polio thing came up early during that period in the 1950s. Vaccine was a new concept. Forgot his name all, but the inventor of the polio vaccine. And that kind of swept through, and my wife says that it was very clear to her, the documentation was sent home, that she was going to be part of an experiment having to do with polio vaccine. And it was considered an experiment. Mass vaccination had not been done in the normal American society. Maybe in the military, yeah, malaria, certainly those who fought in the Far East, Japan and Australia and all those islands. I'm sure they had malaria tablets. They knew about malaria. Still, many people got ill from malaria. One of my friends' father had been in the islands, had fought in Iwo Jima and those things, and caught malaria and had it for the rest of his life. Leftovers and artifacts of the World War II. It was real present and still common. It had its impacts in the 1950s. First grade, I found out I couldn't see anything. That's when glasses started. And the expensive glasses from my parents. Oh boy, great. Okay. First grade, learned to read, liked all the kids. It was a disciplined sort of school. No speaking out of turn, learning to line up and do something. One of the odd things I think I told you about health was that early on, first, second, third grade, every day we had to line up and go outside and stand on the line, and the nurse would come out with a bottle of cod liver oil, and she would pour 1 tablespoon of cod liver oil, and each child would have that tablespoon of cod liver oil with a saltine cracker to eat afterwards. Now, I don't remember at the time how exactly it was served up. I mean, I wish I could say it was in a paper cup, but I'm not sure. It might have been the same spoon, if you can imagine that. But nonetheless, we were all given cod liver oil in elementary schools for health reasons. There was the governments had decided that we need to take better care of our individuals, and that was going on. As I said, there was also work on the interstates. What else was going? Television came along. Television was invented in the 1940s, but not very common, but the networks had come along. And one of the things, if you had money, became you got television. Now, I don't remember sitting around listening to radios like you'll see in some old movies where people listen to these serials, programs on the radio. I don't remember listening to radio. We had a radio phonograph, big piece of furniture. I don't remember where it came from. My father did have some records. They were all made out of clay at the time, so if you broke them, if you dropped them, they broke. They were made out of clay. Vinyl records had not come around. They were all 7 to 8 RPM. The thing had to spin really fast, and you got like 4 songs on a side of the record. But he did have some country music records, and we would listen to that. Music was present in my parents' home. My father, he liked music. He had a guitar, but it wasn't present in everybody's home, as I found out when I went to school, and that's what I learned about other people and what their parents were like, or who they were, or what they did. Some of their parents were mechanics and so on. One of the things that happened, I think, in the 3rd grade was of interest, and again related to the war, was the teacher had sent notice out that if any of the families, if there had been a service member, they would like you to come in and talk about what you'd done during the war. And of course, literally every kid, their father, usually just fathers, but there were also women in the war. I'm not saying that at all. There were. a lot of women involved in World War II in one position or another. But these men came in and they would talk about, and sometimes they had slides, they had pictures, and I very clearly remember aircraft carrier pictures and planes landing on aircraft carriers, and talk of mainly the war in the Pacific. Again, the war ended there later than World War II in Europe, so most of the people I saw in the classroom were all related to the war in the Pacific, Japan. Anyway, the war is still vestiges of the war. Servicemen, everybody had been a serviceman. In fact, it probably became to the point where you didn't really talk about it much, because if you hadn't served, they wanted to know why you hadn't. You know, this was a national effort, and it trickled down all the way. Television came along, and I think it was 1952. One of the first television programs I ever remember, for some reason, it's just odd, is the funeral of Joseph Stalin. Now, he had been a dictator, commander-in-chief, president, whatever you want to call him, of Russia during World War II, and had been instrumental in throwing millions and millions of Russians at the Nazis to defeat them. And I think Russia lost like 50 million people in World War II, a significant number. And he was a very powerful figure in the world. Again, the Russians had not left Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. They had not left, and they had been setting up puppet governments, as they were known, communist puppet governments. Anyway, his death was such national news that it made it on television, and for some reason, I saw the funeral. And again, I think it was 52, that made me 6 years old. It was before I went to elementary school. I know that because I remember it was in the old house, not the newer on the city street house. Okay. Joseph Stalin. Other television, I don't remember much. I don't remember. Yeah, later there were cartoons on television, but television came along. My grandfather, my dad's father, he had a very small television. The screen was about this big, perfectly round, and it was black and white. And for years and years and years, that's the only television he had. And he would watch baseball on this little teeny, it was this big. That was the size of the TV screen at the time. And of course, you had to stick an antenna up, and Winchester was 60, 70 miles away from the local broadcasting stations out of Washington, D.C., so you hardly got any channels to speak of, but you did get to, and I do remember seeing weather, the news. I didn't understand any of the news at all, except the weather you could understand. And at that time, no computers, no anything. The weatherman would bring out an easel with a great big sheet of paper, and with markers or a pen, he would describe what the weather was going to be like. These clouds are coming in here and go down that way, and so on. None of the technology that you take for granted today existed in the early 1950s. Yes, we had a telephone. It was only 4 digits to dial a local number. And everything had like Mohawk. You used abbreviations, M and an O. So you had to remember, you look down on the dial, and it would carry an M beside a number, but it was a memorization technique. So Mohawk 246. That would get you a local connection. Telephones were usually also party lines at the time. You didn't have your own dedicated telephone line. You shared it with a couple other neighbors in the neighborhood. So you could pick up a telephone line and somebody would be talking. Some neighbor had already got the line, so you'd have to wait. The other issue with telephones was that once you were on the phone, you were not supposed to spend very much time on the phone because other people might need it. The other thing with telephone was any call outside of your city was a long distance call, and it cost you so much per minute. So every call long distance was very short in time, and you did it very infrequently. You did not make long distance calls because they got expensive. I don't remember the cost per minute, but it was too much for what people got paid at the time. Okay, the technology you're thinking about, yes, we had electricity. No, we did not have an electric washing machine till I was probably 15. There had started up and they were building laundromats. Laundromats began to appear. Washing machines began to appear. Some richer folks had those sorts of things. No electric dryers, clotheslines stuck everywhere. The technology was just not there. Cars had radios in them, but they were tube radios. If you let the radio on, the car battery would drain down. Um, School, elementary school, maybe, I don't know, there were one teacher per grade, I think. That was it. All women, all in 40s or later. Some were pretty up there. The principals were women. It was all women at that time in elementary school. I don't know if it's changed today or not, but that was the case then. And they did know your name, and I don't know, in a classroom I can visualize there were maybe 15, 20 of us. It was a pretty good number of kids. Began baby boomer population growth, and the school systems probably got ran over in the next following couple years, and there were a lot of school building going on because of baby boomer, lots of kids everywhere. And Little League Baseball formed up. Hadn't been there before, but now there were lots and lots of kids, and it was a good thing to do. That's probably enough of early 1950. There's a ton of other stuff from an economic point of view to cultural. At the time, everybody, prior to the war, you were born, you grew up in a particular place, and you probably stayed there. Your parents lived there. They had owned property there. They had jobs there. You didn't move around a whole lot. And so who you were going to meet eventually, and perhaps marry, was going to be within a 10 or 20 mile radius at most of where you were born and grew up. That had changed because of World War II. But still some element of that present in the 1950s. People came back. I lived on a city street. I lived in the same city there for 12 years or so. And so I got to know a lot of kids, and I turned into a boy man during that period, and obviously met girls, and that all started, but it was local girls, that's the only people you'd ever meet would be local. And schools, I mean, there were kids going in elementary school that lived, many streets over from where I was, and I would never visit them. They were too far away. There was no buses. You had to walk to school. Everybody had to walk to school. I had about a mile walk from my home to the school, and from the age of 7, 6, I walked. There was no fear at the time. Nobody locked their doors, their front doors. There was no crime, or anybody knew of it anyway. There was no internet. There was no cell phones. The only form of news that you could get was from a newspaper. Everybody got the local newspaper, read the local newspaper. Or when television came along, you could get some national news, but not local. The only thing local about what was going on in your neighborhood was gossip or the newspaper. That was it. Okay, that's enough of this. It's 43 minutes. This ought to give a quick little hit as to what life was like in a small town in Virginia in the 1950s, early 1950s, from 1946 to 1952, 53, 54, something like that. Uncle Ron and stuff. Today is the 27th of May. It's raining outside, so that's the reason I started this one. I may do another one on early 1960s because that was a real turbulent period. Lots of changes going on in the United States at that time. Uncle Ron and stuff. This is 1950s and typical, I assume, USA birth childhood. Bye-bye.